Welcome to State of the State, the monthly roundup of policy and research for the state of Michigan, brought to you by the Institute of Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State University and our friends here at WKAR Studios. I'm Arnold Weinfeld, Associate Director for the Institute. I'm joined by my co-host, Institute Director Dr. Matt Grossman, and MSU economist Dr. Charlie Ballard. Later on, we'll be joined by our guest, Dr. Eric Yunke, a political science professor at Michigan State University, who specializes in, among other topics, U.S. electoral institutions. And with the election just over 2 weeks away, that seems to be a timely topic. So let's get right into it with our two favorite subjects, politics and the economy. And with the election less than 2 weeks away, why don't we start with you, Matt, and maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the trends in voting you're seeing. I've seen some figures on absentee ballots that seem astronomical as compared to 4 years ago, but what are you seeing out there?
Well, that's true. Over 1 million people have already voted in Michigan, and we will expect those numbers to climb. Of course, Michigan really did not have the same kind of early voting system that it now has 4 years ago. So it's really sort of uncharted territory for us. But overall, Biden is leading in the national polls. Democrats and Biden are both spending a lot more than Republicans, raising and spending a lot more. And the trends seem to be moving a little bit in the Democratic direction.
And what are you seeing, Matt, in terms of the trends? You mentioned the million voters. And I know I was in an MSU Votes meeting yesterday, and the numbers for East Lansing and Ingham County, those who have requested ballots, absentee ballots, is phenomenal as compared to 4 years ago.
Well, again, you can't really compare to a time when you had to have a excuse to get an absentee ballot and voters weren't used to using the system. But certainly it's a sign of renewed interest. And according to national polls, Biden is ahead by about 40 points among those who say they have already voted. Now that, of course, doesn't mean much because most of those people are people who would have voted on Election Day. And have just displaced those votes to earlier. But it certainly is a sign that Democrats are ready and excited to vote. But I would caution that in both the 2016 and the 2018 elections, we saw early voting enthusiasts talk about Democratic advantages building over time, only some of which materialized when all the votes were counted.
But there does seem to be this general narrative that early voting, voting by mail, absentee voting, however you want to characterize it, does favor Democrats. Is that true?
Well, there's a trade-off because early voting has a higher failure rate, as some people don't follow all the instructions, don't have a signature matching. In Pennsylvania, you even need to have both envelopes in there or it doesn't count, and some people don't get their votes back on time. Now, that doesn't mean it's a loss because is also likely to be some effect on increasing voting among people who might not otherwise show up on Election Day. It's just a trade-off between those two things. The only thing I wouldn't read too much into is to say, here's what's happened so far with the votes returned, unless you're counting for whether those people would have voted anyway, in which case it's just a displacement of a vote rather than a real change.
Mm-hmm. And Charlie, what about the issues that might be impacting the election? It seems a little odd right now that we have a sitting president with an economy that, for some is doing well, for others is not. Certainly COVID-19 has had an impact on that. Who knows when the next stimulus will be coming? What do you think? How's the economy going to play a role in this election?
Well, certainly President Trump is trying to make the case that the economy is in very good shape, based mostly on how the economy was until February of this year. The COVID recession has been a very painful one for millions and millions of Americans. April of 2020 by many measures, is the worst month in the history of the U.S. economy, with 20 million jobs lost. Now, since then, we've bounced back with the help of that big stimulus package that was passed. It appears to me that we could use some more of that, because a lot of that money has now run out. The enhanced unemployment insurance, the PPP loans, and there's ongoing negotiations about some sort of new stimulus, but that hasn't happened yet. So what I have seen is that the economy, after a horrendous fall in the spring, bounced back somewhat. By many measures, kind of regained about half of the lost ground between April and September. But the rate of that increase has slowed down. And so, I, as in line with many economists, believe that we will not get back to, quote, normal, end of quotation, whatever that is, or anything close to normal, until we've got the virus much more under control than we do now. And so many of the forecasts suggest that the economy might be able to return to its pre-COVID state by sometime in late 2021 or in the first half of 2022. And so you've got a very mixed message, mixed bag. It is true that the economy was doing pretty well until February, has not done well since then, although it has bounced back from some of the drop. One thing that I think the Biden campaign has tried to point out is that aggregate measures of economic activity can be misleading, because what had happened before February and what has really happened since then is that higher income workers have generally done pretty well. Even before COVID, those who were doing less well were those at the bottom of the wage scale. And that's been exacerbated by the pandemic, because the job losses have been disproportionately among women, minorities, and households with lower incomes. And so I predict that when we get the Census Bureau report for 2020, that won't be until next September. I think we will have seen a huge increase in income inequality, following upon the 40-year trend that we've had toward increasing income inequality.
Yeah, there seems to be a little question in the readings that I've done that the pandemic has provided an opportunity for an acceleration of changes in the workplace, in how business operates, advancing technological work situations, whether it's work from home. How that all pans out remains to be seen. But I think there's little question that the pandemic has, as I said, exacerbated, as you noted, income inequality, as well as working conditions, changing working conditions being sped up. You mentioned the economy over the last 4 months, let's say 4 or 5 months, and it is interesting to me, back in May, when our revenue estimating conference here in Michigan, when they met, they were predicting, billions of dollars in budget deficits. And by the time we got around to August, with that infusion of CARES money, and I might say that Michigan did very well among the states to distribute that CARES money. One of the top states, I believe, in its distribution patterns. All of a sudden, the budget wasn't quite as bad as we thought back in May. So yeah, you're right. That should send a clear signal that some additional stimulus is needed until we get back to whatever normal might look like.
Yeah, Michigan's budget is in May looked horrifying. It now looks only bad. It's a good thing that we, over the last decade, we did accumulate more than $1 billion in the rainy day fund, which can be used, and also some federal government support has helped to keep the situation for Michigan state and local government from becoming even worse than it was. But it's going to be a challenge. There's no question about it. And the lawmakers in the state of Michigan, who fortunately none of them has been kidnapped yet, but those lawmakers in Michigan face a lot of challenges trying to go through this.
So Matt, let's get back to the national political scene for a moment. Michigan, for many national elections now has been a key player. I think that was the standard even going into last week, and certainly the events of last week with the kidnap plot thwarted against Governor Whitmer has even heightened Michigan's place in national politics. And while the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, right now holds a 8 to 10 point lead, depending what poll you see, the U.S. Senate race here between the incumbent Gary Peters and the challenger John James is categorized by many as a dead heat. What's going on there?
Well, that's right. There are a lot more undecided voters in the Senate race than the presidential race, and Gary Peters has not been able to consolidate Biden's supporters behind him. He started the race as the most unknown, had the most people saying they don't know if they find him favorable or unfavorable of any senator running for re-election this year. And he has sort of kind of maintained a bit of a nondescript image throughout the campaign. It'll be interesting to see if he is able to consolidate support. Michigan does have some partisan ballot voters, and so he will get some help from that if Democrats do win the state at the presidential level by the amount that they're currently ahead in the polls. But John James has again run a good campaign that has separated himself more from Trump than the Republicans running for re-election. And so there's at least some chance for it to go another way. But if Biden wins the state by 8 or 9, it is extremely difficult to see him pulling it out. There will be some Biden-James voters, but not that many.
One of the changes that was passed by voters 2 years ago was to reinstitute straight party ticket voting. And so if you want to, you can fill in the little bubble on your ballot for just voting a straight ticket. And it's widely believed that would help Democrats more than it would help Republicans, although
right.
We'll see.
I'd forgotten about that when I got my ballot and noticed that. So I do wonder about the impact of that. And Matt, what about more on the national scene? There's a lot of talk of the possibility of Democrats taking control of the Senate. What do you see as the chances of Democrats controlling both houses of Congress as well as the president's office?
Well, the models overwhelmingly have Democrats retaining control of the House, so it would be a huge surprise if they don't do that. And they seem to have a better than even chance at the moment, if you believe poll-based models, of winning control of the Senate because they're ahead in Colorado and Arizona. And then they have options in Maine and North Carolina, probably their best options, but then also quite a few others on the board from 2 races in Georgia to Montana where they have some chance. And that is kind of how people are seeing the Michigan race. That is, there could be a candidate advantage for James, but in a year where Democrats are gaining, you really don't expect someone who won by 14 points in a Republican-leaning year to then lose once he's an incumbent in a Democratic-leaning year. That's why it's just such a surprise that he really hasn't generated a big lead at the moment.
Well, since we're talking about forecasting and national races, let's welcome our guest, Dr. Eric Junke. Eric, welcome to the program. Appreciate you taking time here today. And Why don't you talk a bit about the work that that you do on electoral politics?
So my research is focused on elections, particularly state legislative elections across the United States, which is the kind of elections most political scientists disregard, at least in the minority politics literature, which is where my work is situated. So I study elections involving Black and Latino candidates in particular, but also Asian American candidates and Native American candidates, other kinds of candidates. And for the last 10 years, we've been trying to code, meaning observe the race, gender, and ethnicity of every candidate running for state legislative office in the United States, which is thousands and thousands of individuals. And using that data, we can then tell a broader story about American representation.
And what is that research showing?
So it's funny, we were just working on a public piece this morning. One of the really interesting things, and it's probably not too much of a surprise, but I think the surprise is in how stark the difference is between the parties and the kind of demographic profile of the two parties. Over the last 10 years, the majority of gains in representational diversity are coming almost completely from the Democratic side of the aisle. And what's interesting is you can see this before the elections. And so one of the patterns that kind of pops out in my research is that we often have theories around the idea that voters are choosing who's going to represent them, but of course we know that the parties are giving the voters the choices that are on offer. And our research has shown that the Democratic Party has been giving more diverse choices to voters, certainly over the last 10 years, and historically speaking, of course, as well. But if you take the Democratic Party alone, they really do. Right now in 2020, we've coded 21 states already this summer. It looks like the United States. Roughly half of the candidates who are running as Democrats are women, and roughly 40% of their candidates are candidates of color, which almost perfectly matches the United States demographically. On the Republican side, I think we have about 22% of their candidates are women, which is much, much lower. And I think less than 10% of their candidates are candidates of color. And so we can kind of see the partisan choices that they're making in terms of who's running, who's supported, who's recruited, and that's biasing the choices that voters are being given at the ballot box. And our research, to wrap up, our research has shown that it doesn't really matter to voters in a partisan race whether a candidate is Black, Latino, woman. Certainly those candidates face obstacles during the campaign, but in a partisan race, voters typically use party as a cue to make their choices. And we've shown that the Republican Party should definitely be recruiting more diverse candidates to run because they will win.
And tell us about your new project, Election Madness. What's going on this year?
So, so I don't know how much in the weeds. You can cut out some of the weeds that I might get into talking about where this came from, but I've been wanting to do this for years, at least for the last 5 to 10 years. I've been wanting to create a March Madness style game for the elections. There were a lot of obstacles in the way to creating this. First of all, I had no idea how to do anything on the web. But luckily, or unluckily, because of COVID this summer, I had a lot of time on my hands, and I was not motivated to do much, as I think most of us were not motivated to do much. But this kind of got me motivated every morning, and so I learned how to do some things, putting things together on the web, and that was fun. So I finally created this, what amounts to a pick'em game, and we have 21 elections that were chosen because they had interesting dynamics, or they were, at the time, this was in June, July, experts were forecasting that these were going to be very close races, which is important, of course, for a game. And we're asking players to choose the winners of those 21 elections. And in each election, we have kind of calibrated points, just like you would in March Madness. So in March Madness, of course, in the basketball tournament game, there's 15s who play ones. There are 14s who play twos. I probably have that wrong, but we have favorites and upsets, and sometimes the upsets happen, and if that happens in the game, you win the points. And so in our game, I'll go through just a couple of the the elections, I think, that are interesting. We have Meyer-Schulten in Michigan's third is one of our elections, and right now we have Peter Meyer at 4 points and Hillary Schulten at 6 points, and the points roughly correspond to how forecasters see their odds of winning the election. I should say lose the election. So, for example, Peter Meyer right now, experts have, again, with uncertainty, they basically have this as a coin flip election, but with Meyer getting is favored a little bit because this is a Republican district and he has name recognition. So he has about a 40% chance of losing, and we think Schulten has about 60% chance of losing, and so she gets 6 points if you choose her, and 4 points if you choose him. Another one I'll just talk about is the Harrison-Graham race. This is really interesting because in the summer, we have this one at, let's see, you get 8 points if you choose Jamie Harrison and he wins. So we had this as an 80% chance that he was going to lose, and Lindsey Graham at a 20% chance he was going to lose. You get 2 points if you choose Lindsey Graham. But of course, this race has really tightened up, and so this seems like a kind of a prime candidate for an upset pick. If you were doing March Madness, you would have your experts saying this is my lock upset because the polls right now have this very close to 50-50. Although if you look at the expert forecasts, they have this race actually much lower. They think Graham's going to hold on for a number of reasons, despite the fundraising disparities and the polls.
So listeners can play at electionmadness.org if they want to join, and they'll be competing with who?
So right now we have over 3,000 students from across the country who are playing. We recruited a bunch of instructors from around the country to use this in their classes. So that's the majority of people you'll be playing against. You'll also be playing against members of the public who might join. But most fun is you'll be playing against the experts. And Matt, you helped me recruit some really great experts to make picks. We're going to release those picks in a couple of days so that the students can use those to help frame their understanding of these races. Larry Sabato is one of our experts. G. Elliott Morris is another one, two very kind of well-known forecasters. We also have a number of political scientists, yourself included, Matt, Anna Sampaio, Bernard Fraga Parusha, and Kelly Dittmar from Cal. So we have, and then Chris Stout from Oregon State University as well is going to be joining us. So when those experts' points are released, you can kind of play against them and see how well you do.
Does money change hands in this? In March Madness, billions of dollars are exchanged. Is this a betting market that you're running?
We are not. That's a great question. We do not condone betting. This is an educational, for educational purposes only. But I do not. I'm not in your household, and I'm not going to come in and let's just say I have some friendly wagers going with some of my colleagues and friends. And that's a good point. We have an application that was created by Matt's shop, by Jess in Matt's group, where you can actually create a team. You can get your friends and family and colleagues to sign up, and then if you all want to do some friendly wagers, that's great. And that application can be found on the website as well. So you can really kind of go full out with this March Madness.
I just thought I'd share the story that in 1980, I was in graduate school and my dissertation advisor ran an probably illegal betting market and early in the year, I bought shares of George H.W. Bush because I thought that he would do well in the New Hampshire primary, and he did. And then after that, I sold my shares and I profited to the tune of $2.80.
That's great.
Very
So
good.
are any of these experts predicting this upset in the Michigan race, running against a Meyer in West Michigan? Isn't that like running against an Izzo for MSU trustee?
So far, I've only received two expert picks. Today's the deadline, so I'm receiving the rest of them today. Nobody has picked that race, but I am actually picking that race.
You're picking a Schulten upset?
Yes.
All right. And what causes that Schulten optimism?
I think a lot. Well, again, I'm wrong all the time. So, don't put any money on my words, but I just think that the Democratic wave is going to be fairly massive, particularly and it's going to carry a lot of these House races. So for the same reasons we think Peters might kind of be carried over the finish line, I think if you think that race was 50-50 or 60-40 before we see how well the top of the ticket is doing, I think she has a chance.
What I'd like to ask each of you is, the popular notion is that we won't know who won possibly for days or weeks. And I think it will be fairly clear within 24 hours as to who our winner is. The issue to me is the lawsuits that will come afterwards, especially from those states that have close races, such as maybe a North Carolina, a Texas, a Arizona, Nevada situation. What do you all see as when this election might be decided?
Well, if it comes down to one pivotal state, as it did with Florida or Ohio in 2004, the parties will certainly litigate everything possible to gain an advantage. But if we have a situation where one of the candidates, especially Biden right now in the polls, is ahead in 5 or 6 states, it's just really hard to litigate that to a different resolution. So I think it depends how close it is. But right now it's looking like we have a much better chance of knowing on election night or shortly thereafter. Sometimes people take the sort of worst case, like California House races, where they really do change in the 10 days following the election, and they think that's going to be true nationwide. But it's not clear that that's the case. For example, in Florida, they count the absentee ballots much faster. And so, if there's an indication there, that would obviously tell us a lot about the national race.
Right. So, the narrative here in Michigan regarding those absentee ballots, been a lot of consternation about when we can start processing, even though the legislature just passed the law. But many states that have had early voting, vote by mail, absentee for years are much more expert and adept at processing and counting the ballots early. Is that correct?
Yes, which does mean that, Michigan will be predicted to have a little bit more trouble because it's a huge change compared to states like Colorado and Oregon that have been doing it for a very long time. But it really does depend on how close the races are. If we start to see signs that Joe Biden is winning states like North Carolina, Florida, Ohio, Iowa, then we really just don't have to wait for the final counts everywhere else. The chances that Trump pulls it out is very low at that point.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank Eric for being with us today. Matt and Charlie, any final thoughts?
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be an interesting couple of weeks here.
Indeed, that's what I keep telling people. Buckle up. The roller coaster's just about halfway through. So many ups and downs and turns. Matt?
And if listeners want to play the game, again, it's at electionmadness.org. So you can get a group together and play against one another or try to beat me. That's fun.
Well, thank you all for being with us. Always a pleasure to be with you, Charlie and Matt. Eric, thank you again. That's all the time we have on this edition of State of the State. My thanks again to Russ White and the staff at WKAR for their support of this program. Join us again next month on State of the State.